Our round one rookie draft takeaways. We are jumping into the ADP, looking through the drafts that have occurred so far. And of course, Shawn drafting with some of the RotoViz team, including myself over at the FFPC. So we are going to look through some of those. And we're also going to look through when we get to round two, myself and Shawn currently on the clock. That will be the topic of conversation in one of our shows later this week as we break down the options of who to select there. But Shawn, we are into rookie draft season. Some drafts obviously are starting right after the NFL draft, but pretty much across the board up and running now. And these leagues that we're talking about today will be in the RotoViz Triflex leagues. It'll be Superflex and then tight end premium. But looking forward to diving through and having some conversation here about the picks, what maybe could have went different, and how to reflect on things. So how are you feeling? As I know you have a number of drafts on the go right now.
Awesome, Colm. This has been so much fun. It feels like I've been on the clock for the last 48 hours straight, in part because I more or less have a lot of drafts going, a lot of trades out there. The trade talks are probably the most fun part of Dynasty. Colm, this is going to be a great week for our Dynasty Reanimator series. We had some fun shows with the Dynasty topic last week, and then, now just rocket fuel added to it here with these drafts going. Obviously, we know a lot of our listeners are participating in the FFPC, so they will be kind of, working alongside with us. But we also have lots and lots of listeners who are playing in a variety of similar formats in home leagues, which, may end up drafting a couple weeks from now, may end up drafting middle of the summer.
Yeah.
And this just helps get us all sort of prepared for those drafts. Colm, I have a bunch of industry drafts that will be starting over the next couple of weeks. And so, having this great experience with the RV Triflex leagues gets me prepared for those drafts. As you can tell, I'm pretty fired up. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward. I don't know where you want to kick this one off. Do you want to start with our draft? Do you want to start with some of the T leagues maybe where you've had the higher picks? Or do you want to start just in general with round one and we work our way through the ADP in general?
Well, Colm, the gambit we're going to try, it's not really a gambit, but the gimmick here will be to kind of pick out a draft where we have the draft slot and kind of work forward from there. And one of the most fun drafts I've been involved in is the one with Blair. We did win the back draw. And again, in the FFPC format, you have to win the back draw to get the 101. That part of the format is a lot of fun. So we won the back draw. The thing that we need to have...
Shawn, can we make the back draw compulsory in all Dynasty leagues?
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting a new format, you have to have that, right? You don't
eliminates any form of tanking, eliminates all of those scenarios. Pretty much all of them. There'll still be ways around it, but it does eliminate the majority of them.
Well, it makes it a lot harder. And you don't want to get into these situations where, and I have had this in very competitive leagues, and it's very understandable because each individual team should be following their own incentives. But when you get to the point where 9 teams are rebuilding, it does sort of invalidate the overall process. You want more than 3 or 4 teams actually going for the title in any given year. And, having the back draw does cut through some of that. One of the things that I love about the FFPC format is that in each year we can go for it with an awesome young team. And if you get, 2/3 of the way through and you're probably going to miss, you can sort of redirect a little bit and instead point yourself at the back draw if you've kept your own pick. And then you're looking forward to setting up this empire, right? Which in other formats, you do have to tank to do it, which I don't think is nearly as much fun. So Blair and I had a good team. We had some quarterback injuries. We had some general injuries. We missed the playoffs. We win the back draw. We have a loaded team. We have the 101. Colm, we had discussed possibilities for moving back. As I'm looking at my different leagues here, I only have one that Marvin Harrison went first. Obviously, there are going to be some situations where the manager who has the 101 is loaded at QB. And so you want to take that potentially generational prospect at wide receiver. I guess I would not quite put Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors in that category, whereas Brock Bowers is a generational prospect at tight end. But we had the 101. We discussed a little bit, do we move down? One of the things that I was thinking in my head, Jaden Daniels, probably the better individual season like top end guy. So you move down. The team with the 102 had Justin Fields. Maybe they'd be willing to give up Fields just for that one spot move. You look at the team in the third spot, maybe they'd be willing to do some type of trade with like Jonathan Taylor for Christian Watson. One of the issues there is that sadly, it's not that hard to see a scenario in 6 months where Christian Watson and Jonathan Taylor have actually flip-flopped spots at ADP. So you've got to keep your eye on that. What would you have thought if we had moved back to the third spot and taken Jaden Daniels and picked up Justin Fields and Jonathan Taylor to do that versus what we did, which in the end was the safe route of saying our team is loaded. We don't need to take these risks. Let's just add Caleb Williams.
Yeah, I think both options really have their merits. And one of the advantages here, Shawn, is I don't have the overall roster I obviously have the draft board that Shawn has shared, don't have the roster, but both of those have merits. And one of the things we do talk about is, opening up the multiple pathways to potential victory through different scenarios, and adding in those additional pieces could help to do that. Something that myself and yourself, when we get to our team, we'll talk about is we did a trade not that long ago where we acquired Justin Fields, and when we're looking at our roster at the moment, as we sit on the clock at the second round, and that it is a quarterback that will be discussed in the show later in the week, but it's kind of some of those pieces are still questionable as to what their impact will be in 2024. But you mentioned there the likes of Christian Watson and Jonathan Taylor. There's quite a few players that are very much in flux across the dynasty landscape at the moment in terms of how they're shifting values. Could continue to go down the way or could bounce back in the case of, let's say, Christian Watson or Justin Fields as well. I do like it, the 101, if you do have the option, and it isn't something that feels like this is completely going to change I guess it's the same as the NFL draft. It's not going to completely change the outlook of how your team's going to look. I think sitting with the Caleb Williams pick there makes a lot of sense in terms of the quarterbacks. The other thing, Shawn, with all of these leagues, there's only one of them where it has gone quarterback, but one of the drafts that you're doing by yourself did go with Caleb Williams and then Jaden Daniels. So there is always the risk. And I guess the one safe floor with that part is that if both of those quarterbacks did go, you would potentially be left with Marvin Harrison. But all the other leagues that you have taken part in so far has been Williams and Harrison in the 1-2. And only in one of them, obviously, you mentioned there Harrison going first. But outside of that, you probably do feel pretty safe that Daniels does make it to you. But was there a concern when you were thinking about that negotiation that both quarterbacks go 1 and 2?
Well, I don't think so. And partly we were looking at the individual managers, and I felt pretty confident we could move down to 3, especially when you see these trends where Marvin Harrison is going with the second pick almost every time. One of the things to note here when you have that top spot is I think that if your team is loaded like Blair's and mine, fortunately is, then you can probably play it safe, because creating more total assets, that doesn't help you as much in that they become a little bit redundant.
The other part I was going to say is a bit like I've discussed with some of the trades that we didn't accept. One recently involving Gardner Minshew, but when you are adding those additional pieces in the FFPC, there is not huge rosters, so there is a little bit of a roster crunch at points when you're adding in these rookies, and then eventually at some point we're going to have to cut it back down to a 20-man roster.
We will. So that is a consideration. I think if you got the 101 because your team was awful, you took over an orphan, or you kind of hit the end of the road and had to completely rebuild, you got yourself the 101. In those cases, I do think that you want to go ahead and have humility and realize that even Caleb Williams could miss. And that if you're moving down to guys like Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Jaden Daniels, Brock Bowers, that you're still getting an elite prospect. And so you want to go ahead and make that move. We didn't. So, Colm, then the 102 was mostly Marvin Harrison. If I had the 102, I would probably move out of it. I have Jaden Daniels 102 in my rankings because he offers this scoring mix that is so rare, right? Is there injury risk? Is there some bust risk? Yes, there's more bust risk, obviously, with Jaden Daniels than there is with Marvin Harrison. And yet, I think we're probably overstating the ceiling for Harrison and understating the ceiling for Daniels when we work through this. One of the things that Monty and I did, and Monty and I have a team where we just desperately need a quarterback. We had the 105. We did pay a decent amount. We moved from the middle of round 2 back into round 3. And there are some interesting picks in round 2, which we'll get to in the next show. But we did that to move up to 104 because as we looked at the rosters, we did think that Jaden Daniels was likely to make it to us if we moved to 104. And then, unfortunately, that was one of the leagues where he goes 103 and Malik Neighbors gets through. What are your thoughts on this 2, 3, 4 range, how you'd be playing it based on your roster? Monty and I obviously are in the situation where a lot of OT listeners are, where we have both Laporta and McBride. And so, I mean, Powers is still somebody you want. I'll cover that in a minute, the trade that Bjorn and I made. But if you have those two guys and you desperately need a QB, that's where I would pay to move up, even though obviously mostly Colm we recommend moving down.
Yeah, and just a question on that one. When you moved up to the 104, at what point was that pre-draft? Was the draft underway? Obviously,
it was right before the draft started.
Okay, so obviously there's no way to know for definite. And then in that particular situation, Shawn and Monty have taken Neighbors with that selection. Daniels going at the 103. So that is unfortunate with trying to plot it out and plan it out, and then it leaves you in a situation where there's a little bit more pressure. Just looking through that draft board, Shawn, you had no pick then in the second round. Is that correct? In that draft, that was your picking at the 104, and then you have a pick at the 111 after that, and then you're into the third round. Is that correct?
It is. And the thing that happened there, we actually traded in to the 111. And so we'll cover that in a minute. But we had the 205. We moved back to the 302 in order to move up the one spot. I don't think I think that's a very fair type of trade. Makes things work for both people. I do think that a lot of managers have a tier break after the 104. And even though I don't, you got to respect that when you're trying to move up. And so I thought it was a very favorable negotiation in that both managers were willing to work on the needs that they had and not try and win the trade individually. What you're trying to do is win the trade versus the other 10 managers. The problem that you get into in some trade discussions is that the manager wants to win the trade against you as opposed to win the trade against the other 10 teams. Fortunately, that wasn't the case here. Both of us were able to accomplish our objectives, even though in the case for Monty and me, we didn't get the QB that we so desperately needed. But Colm, we went ahead then and continued to make picks to lock in what we see as future star players. And Monty and I are going to have a roster now where we have the best running back group in the league, the best wide receiver group in the league, and the best tight end group in the league. Quarterback continues to be a big problem.
To work it out.
But I mean, one of the things that's funny in these triflex leagues is that the backups are difficult to own. And so if you were aggressive on the waiver wire in season, you will often find the teams that are in the semifinals and those are actually playing a star quarterback and then a backup quarterback. We don't have the star yet, but certainly if you can work through with the backups and then Colm, one of the things that we did do here, which was somewhat controversial, is that Xavier Worthy fell to the 111. And we moved in with Brandon Ayuk to pick up the 111, and we did select Worthy instead of Bo Nix, which we'll get to in a minute. But that's a little bit getting ahead of the game in terms of thinking through that pick.
That was the reason I was trying to factor in, when the trade happened and how it all kind of came about, to have that picture painted. Because again, when we get to round 2, you mentioned Bo Nix there. He is going to be part of that conversation for us. And we also took Worthy a couple of picks before you did at the 111 here in this one. So the question being, when you get that, Neighbors pick after missing out in Daniels at 4, what are the options as a kind of fallback plan? And obviously you continue to build down on the strength. And that is part of the question as well when you mentioned, what do we think of the kind of opening tier off the draft with the 2 quarterbacks, the 2 wide receivers, and I would put Bowers in there. I think the 5 of those are probably at the front end for me of the players I would like to be taken. Obviously, when we look through these drafts and the ADP, Bowers generally going 6 or 7 in most of these drafts. You have one draft where he's gone at pick 5, and that's kind of the conversation again of potentially moving back a couple of spots and still potentially being able to get him. But a bit like when you've traded up, it can be a fine, depending on the league, it can be a fine margin to go through. And I do want to highlight it again. Shawn has his top 50 rookies out on rotoviz.com, but also is split into, when to kind of trade back, when to make the selection, and lots more information in there. So I'd highly recommend to read through that piece for the strategy element, even if you've already drafted in them. Lots of good information in there from Shawn. But those are the guys that I've had. The one player, Shawn, then is probably the next player after that I've been surprised by. When we were talking about our pick originally at the 107 in our draft, we're trying to work out who may go, and Odunze was the player then that we kind of got to. And when we were working through it and you mentioned to me, I was thinking he may be more so at the 109 maybe, for example. But pretty consistently across the board, he has been going off at that 105, 106 range. And he is the player kind of in that first round that I feel is a little bit earlier than I was expecting when, factoring in, 2-3 weeks ago before the NFL draft as to where these players kind of line up, when you're factoring in those quarterbacks as well. Were you surprised at how aggressive drafters have been in selecting him? It's a great landing spot, gets in there with the 101 in these drafts and Williams, but also is, he's getting 2 veterans to learn a lot from, but they're also veterans where he's likely not going to go in and just be the wide receiver 1 this season on that roster.
Yeah, and I think that it is justifiable to bank on him eating or carving out a big role right away. And we do see that happen. We saw it happen with Jamar Chase. We saw it happen with CeeDee Lamb. It was one of the reasons that we had the pro thesis on Jackson Smith and Jigba last year.
We also have those, and I know I'm not betting completely against talent, for example, but the roadblocks are the players that were in front of Jamar Chase, for example, for him to get into that workload weren't the same as DJ Moore and Keenan Allen this year.
They're not. And I think that it is important to remember that, because it's easy to feel like because the situations are broadly the same, that they can work out the same way. It's the same thing with CeeDee Lamb, where you have Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup. The number one thing to keep in mind is that Odunze is not the same level of prospect of Lamb or Chase. And so that part makes it a little bit different. And then the guys blocking him are also not the same.
Yeah.
And you have a rookie QB and you have questions at coordinator. And so for that reason, I have Odunze at 10. Ben and I had a long sort of string of emails as we did our draft this weekend, working through our picks, but also kind of poking fun at each other for our Worthy and Odunze rankings. Obviously, there's pushback on where I have Odunze ranked. And one of the things I would just say is that I do have them in the same tier. And if you have the guy in the same tier and you feel a little bit more strongly about him, feel free to make that move. But I do think there's an element in which buzz and trendiness creates some arbitrary swings in terms of when we prioritize the QB and when we feel comfortable going in a slightly different direction. So it does become a very interesting one, because 5-6. And so Ben and I had the 105. We had made a move to solidify QB before the draft, and that left us with the 105 and tight end as our need. Slam dunk for Brock Bowers. Bjorn and I had the 5 and 6, and what we need is quarterbacks. We're sitting there trying to move up to the 103, can't get a trade done. The prices were too high there, but at the same time, that's perfectly fine. The manager who owns the 103 has every right to ask for what he or she feels like the value is. So
they
just
have
because
the
it's too
leverage.
high, yeah, and it's their pick, so they get to set the price on it, right? You don't have it. We couldn't make the move up there to get in range for a QB. And our plan was to sit tight and take Bowers and to take May. May gives us the first QB that we need to go along with Sam Howell. And then we had some contingencies in place to get a second QB as we move through the draft. What ended up happening was that at the 104, the manager there, and we were hoping that Daniels might slide through because the manager with the 104 needed a tight end and had plenty of quarterbacks. So, Colm, what happened? And sometimes you have these sort of glorious moments of serendipity. That manager took Jaden Daniels. And then we're kind of sitting there on the clock at 105. Like, we're not in any rush to make these picks because we don't like our options and maybe we'll get an offer. And so we're not going to stall the clock out for the whole time, but we're going to let things play out a little bit, see what pops up. Other managers have needs. Colm, we got an offer of Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels, and the 209 for Brandon Ayuk, the 105, the 106, and the 203. Right? So it's essentially a 3 for 2.
Hit us with the whole deal again, just for us to digest.
Yeah, so we get Burrow and Daniels. So 2 foundation QBs. The other manager gets Ayuk, the 105 and the 106. We also have to move back 6 spots in round 2. Now, one of the things I like about that is that we do move back. We don't completely lose the pick. And for me, that's a big deal because it probably would have been justifiable for the manager simply to ask for the 203 outright, which, then we might even deny it, even though it'd be very difficult to not get the foundation QBs and completely fix now the team for the long run, because Bjorn and I had 11 picks in rounds 2 and 3, and we had a decent roster to start with, right? So now we're set. And having the 105 and the 106 was a big deal because those picks matter. And that brings us back to Odunze because, Colm, the interesting thing here is that Bowers made it through the 5 and the 6. Odunze was the pick at 6, right? And that part, again, I struggle with because, again, Brock Bowers is not just above Odunze. He is above Marvin Harrison and above Malik Neighbors. Does that mean he'll be more valuable in your league? Not necessarily. You need to understand your format. So make sure you're working through that aspect of it. But Brock Bowers is absurd. The thing that we then did when he made it to 107 was we came back in and we offered Pickens, Kmet, the 205, and the 402 for Bowers. So we got him as well. And now that we've moved both Ayuk and Pickens, which are really the 2 guys I'm trying to move this offseason. It's not that I don't like them or don't think they'll be good. The reason that I have them on almost every team is that I do like them, right? I mean, what you're stuck with moving, the guys you have the option to trade are the people that you did like. And I'm not selling them necessarily in redraft, although I do think that their ADPs are a little bit problematic. But for Dynasty, we have a little bit of a peak right here. And you're not going to always be right. But again, buying low and selling high in Dynasty is a matter of understanding profiles and understanding how the valuations are going to move. It's going to be easier than stock trading, for example, right? When we're trying to buy low and sell high. Wanted to get out of those players, end up with those picks. So I think that Bowers, May, and Odunze at 5, 6, and 7 are the picks in that range. And then, Colm, that takes us to us, where we had the 107. Odunze is there.
Before that one, Shawn, had you obviously you make the trade back up to the 107 to get Bowers. That pick is made, I assume, when the 107 is on the clock. Is that correct? And the other part of that is when you made the trade back, I assume you make that trade back thinking, well, Bowers is going here. Could you what was your feeling when Bowers wasn't the pick and he was available at the 107? You pull off that trade back up. It feels here like this could be one of those scenarios where you are talking about, in 5 years about these 2 trades you pulled off in the first round of the 2024 rookie draft to load this team up for the future.
Yeah, it really did seem magical. And one of the reasons you can do it is that we had stockpiled a lot of picks. And so I think that sometimes when you're perpetually reloading, sometimes when you're trading down in startups, sometimes when you're trading down in rookie drafts, and a lot of the other managers are like, that's fine, and we understand what they're doing, but basically what they're going to end up with are too many of these picks that are worth something, but not enough to make a difference. And there will be cases where that turns out to be true, right? So you have to have humility even about what the likely conclusion of your overall strategy is. Sometimes perpetual reloading will move you out of a guy who ends up with 5 more good seasons and into 3 very, very much wider range of outcomes plays, and all 3 of them miss, or both of the 2 of them miss. But what you're trying to do is make sure that you have a lot of paths, but then also a lot of ammunition. Because if Bjorn and I don't have this ammunition, we're not able to take advantage of a situation where a different manager has objectives that dovetail so perfectly with what we want to do. There's never a situation where you can pull off a win-win trade with another manager where you're winning again against the other 10 teams. That's the key to this whole thing. You can never get that if you don't have ammunition, right? So we're sitting there with a lot of different ways that we can play this. And yeah, as soon as we traded the 5 and 6, being 1000% sure that Bowers would go, and he doesn't go at 5 and 6, then we were immediately like, what do we have to give to get the 107? Because whatever that is, we're going to pay it. We have lots of extra stuff. Let's get Brock Bowers. And now this is a team with the multiple QBs, the foundation QBs. It's a team with Bijan Robinson, and it's a team with McBride, Laporta, and Bowers in a tight end premium where you can start all 3 of those guys. And then our receivers now, after we've moved both Pickens and Ayuk, are starting to get weaker, but we continue to have more picks, and we'll work to build that part of the roster. But the bones of this team now are very, very strong. Colm, so the controversial player in there is Odunze. You and I had the 107, and we were talking about how we loved that the 107, in our view, got more valuable when Odunze at least went to a position that a lot of people do seem to like. It gets more valuable when J.J. McCarthy goes to the Minnesota Vikings, really helping to put a high floor for him. And then when Xavier Worthy goes to the Kansas City Chiefs, which I would argue puts one extra guy into that tier. And I have Worthy just above, actually, the quarterbacks on Odunze. We had the 107. It was the middle of the night in Ireland. And I'm like, I think the moving down one spot here when we could still get McCarthy. If Colm wants to go that direction, we can still get Worthy.
There was no fear that I was going to be furious when I seen this trade had been completed, no?
I didn't feel that way. So I did move us down from the 107 to the 108, and we picked up a future 3rd, gave up a future 5th. It's kind of one of those where you don't necessarily want to ask for the 3rd straight out because it's probably too much, but you're trying to accumulate as many 1, 2, and 3s as you can. So we pick up essentially a future 3. We move down a spot. If it had not been middle of the night in Ireland, what would your thoughts have been there? Would you have been locked into Odunze? Do you prefer moving down? How should listeners be playing this?
Well, that was, when we're in our draft, my hope is at, as it progresses. So just for people to hear the ADP is how it went. It went Williams, Harrison, Neighbors, Daniels, May, Bowers, Odunze, and then it was our selection. So I was, who do you want? I would like Bowers to make it, to that selection. And then I think it would have been a more tricky conversation. The part then where I was kind of quite comfortable with when we were messaging back and forth is McCarthy or Worthy, both of those I was kind of comfortable with. So then when it is the 107 moving back one slot, either way, we are guaranteed to get one of those guys on the board at the next selection. So I was quite comfortable with that. And this is a team that, does need some quarterback attention, I think it would be the word we'd use. We have Sam Howell on the roster. We have Justin Fields, who I mentioned earlier, on the roster. And then we have 2 on the roster. So there is the potential for that to look really good by week 8, or there's the potential for that to be, if there's an injury to 2, or else you're starting one quarterback and you're trying to fill in with tight ends and so on, as Shawn mentioned a moment ago. So I was comfortable with that particular move back, and really to pick up, you want to pick up something that is worthwhile, but to pick up anything that's going to bolster your draft in future years, or in this particular draft, would have been worth it at that point, because I was quite comfortable. It wasn't that I had to have either one of those players specifically. I was happy to have them both. And as you mentioned earlier, they're in the same tier there for me with Worthy and McCarthy in terms of who you would have on the roster. So all of those worked. If we were at the 107 and Bowers had a minute one more pick, let's say Odunze went at the 6th selection, I think we probably hold firm there and add him, even though we have a strong tight end room, as you mentioned, with the group that you mentioned a moment ago. It can never be too strong.
And the situation that we found ourselves in is we don't have Rashee Rice on this team because we did take it over and we weren't in position to make those selections last year, in part because we acquired Kenneth Walker. In that dynamic especially, I really want Worthy. But Colm, as you mentioned, we didn't have the QB. So we tried to trade down several spots. We thought Worthy could get a little bit later. Looking at my other leagues, he goes after McCarthy in most of them. And in one of the leagues, McCarthy even went ahead of both Brock Bowers and Drake May. What are your, actually two of the leagues, McCarthy goes ahead of May. What are your thoughts about taking the Chiefs receiver here as opposed to JJ McCarthy?
Well, again, not to spoil our full conversation for the next show coming out, it was the case there that we talked about, basically a 1v1 in Worthy and Bo Nix, if that was the way it worked out for us in the second round, or if it was a case where we're taking JJ McCarthy there and what we're looking to do in the second round if we can't move back. And one of the things, Shawn, to discuss there for us is we did have an offer, and similar to it, I was interested in your thoughts because you talked about having the resources in that particular last trade where we talked about getting up to get buyers and to get those other trades done. In that situation, in the first trade there, you moved the 105 and the 106. We did have an offer while we were on the clock at the 107 for Aaron Rodgers and the 2025 first round pick for our 107 to move out of getting Worthy, and that would have potentially freed us up to not need to attack the quarterback position in the second round and look for a Nix, or what happens if we make the move to go and get Worthy there and then Nix goes at the 112, for example. So we did have a similar offer like that while we were on the clock. We had some back and forth on it, Shawn, and I kind of was sharing the opinion that I think we're at the very end of Rodgers' career here, whether it's 1 year or 2 years. And the other part is that I don't know. I just don't think there's a huge amount of value in rostering him this season. I know we're hoping that we see big things from Garrett Wilson, for example, but I think in terms of when we're looking at the Aaron Rodgers profile, I'm not as maybe I thought that you might have been when we were having this discussion. What was your thoughts on that particular? I'm always interested if it's a league where it's not me and you. Are you making that particular trade? When we're looking at perpetual reloading, picking up that 2025 first. But I thought trading out of the first round this year was too much to give up to do that particular trade.
The part that you mentioned earlier that makes it a little bit harder in this format is simply that because of the 20 roster spots, there's a limit to how many quarterbacks you can realistically roster. And that does make them a little bit more freely available. At the same time, I think these trades would be very straightforward if we had 25 roster spots, say, because any Dynasty Superflex league where you have additional spots, you want to have as many of those quarterbacks as you can, even if the quarterbacks aren't that valuable individually, because once you're in season, then you can stream them.
Yeah.
And if you can stream all your backups in Superflex, it gives you the ability to address that position without having to pay the massive costs that you have to pay in a startup. And then the even larger cost you often have to pay to trade for a meaningful starter, once those guys are all locked in to individual rosters. So it would have been, and I kind of regret this, but we didn't know that the Raiders were going to whiff at QB when we passed on the Minshew offer earlier. Now, That would have been an absolute slam dunk. If we take that, then it's easier to maybe not worry about the Aaron Rodgers offer. I think I would have taken the offer because it's easy to, I think, miss the value of a 1 year player in Dynasty if that 1 year addresses a clear need and it's not very expensive and it keeps the paths open. So in our case, Rodgers would eliminate QB issues. And now, not necessarily completely eliminate, because he could get hurt like he did last year, right? But it mitigates a lot of the different problems that could come up. So you get him and you get the future first. And then a little bit of a spoiler for the future show, but something that really needs to be discussed now in context, which is that we're on the clock at the 202, and we have a trade offer to move that for a future first.
Yeah.
But we put ourselves in a position where we kind of need Bo Nix to make the roster work. Well, if we had Rodgers, we wouldn't need Nix. We would have already the 2 first-round picks for next year, and we could take this trade as well and have 3 first-round picks for next year. And now we're actually perpetual reloading. We've got enough ammunition. We're set to win this year, and there are so many different things that can play out in the future where we win. Now we've kind of locked ourselves into Worthy and Nix in a fashion which we now need those picks to really work. And so I would probably do it the other way, but it's hard for me to say. I mean, in some ways it's hypocritical for me to be pushing Worthy and pushing Nix for months, and then we get them and we're set up perfectly to have them in the draft and be like, oh, I would have just moved those guys for future picks. That part of it I think is problematic as well. Obviously, I love having Worthy and Nix.
Yeah, so we're going to talk. We don't have Nix yet, Shawn. We're going to save that for the next show. We haven't made that selection. But as the end of that round of the draft played out, we mentioned as far as Worthy there, JJ McCarthy did go then at the pick 9. And then the guys that I think almost fit into the round 2 conversation, but they are going at the back end of round 1 and kind of different orders from time to time. And some of these are falling into early round 2, and that is Jonathan Brooks, Brian Thomas, and Ladd McConkey. You do see across Shawn's leagues here, we get Bo Nix at the 112 in one of those, but it is kind of those names. That was Shawn, so you can blame Shawn for that. Shawn, Bo Nix did go at the 109 in your draft with Ben. That was not you, so there is that to consider as well. So we'll talk maybe about them leading into the guys that would be the options for us in the round 2 conversation. But I thought Shawn talking through, the perpetual reloading element of, if we take both of those offers, it does set us up really, really strongly in the future scenario is very valid. And, when we were talking through it, that first offer with Worthy and the Rodgers in the first, we obviously don't know that somebody's going to come up and offer that pick in the second round. But again, making those moves can open up those doors. So a good part of the conversation, and something that Shawn can wholeheartedly blame me for in the future if it doesn't all work out. But we are looking forward to round 2 and making those selections, and we'll work through how that ADP is looking out on our show that will come out on Wednesday. So make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is available. We're always looking for your suggestion for topics and content. We get lots of good questions and ideas coming in from the RotoViz Overtime community. We are going to use one of those on the Friday edition this week to talk through some of Shawn's rankings. And of course, we will have some RotoViz Overtime listener leagues over at the FFPC coming up in the coming weeks. We have a lot of people interested already. So if you are interested, let me know on Twitter at Overtime Ireland or email across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. But until we are back, my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work on rotoviz.com. And until next time, have a good one.